Tim Harford, a celebrated journalist and broadcaster, most well known for his book-turned Financial Times column, The Undercover Economist, in which he responds to daily struggles and concepts with economic advice and explores the economics behind everyday topics. Here now at the Asian Evaluation Week 2024, Tim Harford.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Manny. Thank you for that video introduction. I can see myself just getting older. As the seconds go by, I'm losing my hair, getting more wrinkles. It's nice. I think about the great circle of life as I watch that, and I think about what it was like to be young. I think back to my second birthday. Do you know, when I turned 2 on my second birthday, my sister was born. Can you imagine being born on my birthday? The attention-seeking of it is absolutely astonishing. These kinds of things would happen. I have 3 younger sisters. So my first sister was born, and then my second sister was born, and then my third sister was born. And every time one of these things happened, I would turn to my mother and I would say, "What's going on? Where are all these babies coming from?" And my mother would tell me something that I think many mothers have said to their children over the years. My mother explained to me, "The babies are brought by the stork. It's a great big bird. You can see the baby in a blanket, and the bird flies in, and it leaves the baby on the doorstep, and that is where babies come from. If you have your own ideas about where babies come from, I don't want to hear them." Now, you may think, look, this is just a story that we tell children. Babies do not actually come from storks. But I can prove, using statistics, that storks deliver babies. If you get the data on countries around the world, and you look at the number of babies born in each country, and you look at the population of storks in each country, and you plot those 2 things together, you will find the pattern is absolutely undeniable. Countries with more storks have more babies. The way statisticians sometimes call this pattern, they call it interocular. It hits you between the eyes. Or you could run a proper statistical test, a scientific test. And indeed, a paper has been published in the scientific literature with the title, "Storks Deliver Babies, P equals 0.008. And without getting too technical, that is proof that this is not a coincidence. Now, you may be thinking, what is going on? How can I deliver this statistical proof that storks deliver babies? Or maybe you've already figured out what is happening. If you haven't figured out what's happening, I'm going to give you a clue. Let me put some names on some of this data. Here we have countries such as Poland, Turkey, France. I'm looking at Europe. And here we have countries such as Monaco, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, the Vatican City. If I was looking at data from Asia, I might have here, China, India, down here, maybe Vanuatu. You can see the reason that countries with lots of storks also have lots of babies is we're just talking about big countries. And little countries, not many storks, not many babies. A statistician would call this, it's called a causal fork. So bigger places have more babies and more storks. Just another bit of proof that you can prove absolutely everything you like with statistics. And you would have got that impression if you had read, as I did, a little book called How to Lie with Statistics, which was first published in the 1950s by a journalist called Darrell Huff. Now, How to Lie with Statistics, it's a great book, it's a small book. It's got cartoons, it's got jokes, it's got examples, and I read this when I was a teenager, explains a lot about me. It's a really great illustration of all the ways that we can use quantitative evidence to tell lies. And if you read the book, you'll learn a lot. You will encounter the storks and babies example. It's right there. And I used to tell people, oh, if you want to understand statistics, if you want to understand quantitative evidence, you should read How to Lie with Statistics. I don't quite think that anymore. Because the more my career has gone on, and the more I've spent my time as a journalist and as a writer dealing with data, dealing with statistics, dealing with evidence, the more I realize that there is a problem with that message. Because in the whole book, How to Lie with Statistics, there's really not a lot about how to tell the truth with statistics, or about how to find out the truth with statistics. And I think it's a problem that a book like this, which is the best-selling book in English ever published about statistics, it's a problem that from cover to cover, this book is just a warning about misinformation. And if that's the way that we view quantitative evidence, oh, it's like a joke, it's like a trick, it's like stage magic, don't ever believe it. If that's what we think about quantitative evidence, we're missing something really important. It turns out that the same year that How to Lie with Statistics was published, warning people evidence is a joke, numbers are a joke, statistics are a joke, don't believe them. That was also the year in which two British epidemiologists, Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill, published some of the first really convincing evidence that smoking cigarettes causes cancer. This is an incredibly important scientific discovery. It's, over the years, saved the lives of millions, maybe tens of millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions of people. And you can't discover something like that without statistical evidence. And I want people to look at these two things that both happened in the 1950s. This book, How to Lie with Statistics, and this incredibly important discovery of Doll and Bradford Hill. I want people to look at them and to say, I'm on the side of taking evidence seriously. I don't just think it's a joke. This really matters. Because if all you think of is that evidence is designed to trick people, you get to a very dark place. In the 1960s, the United States government, Congress, started holding hearings about the dangers of cigarettes. And one Senate hearing asked the question, should we put health warnings on packets of cigarettes? And they invited lots of experts in, cancer experts, statistical experts, to give their views. And one of the experts who was invited in told the senators, well, senators, it is true that there is a correlation between cigarettes and lung cancer. But you know it's also true that there's a correlation between storks and babies. And the Senate chair said, do you really mean to tell me you think that there is as casual a connection between cigarettes and lung cancer as there is between storks and babies? And the expert said, Senator, the two seem to me about the same. And the expert witness's name was Darrell Huff, the author of How to Lie with Statistics. This person that many geeks like me view as an inspiring figure, he ended up working for the tobacco company. and just using statistics to spread confusion and to make people misunderstand the truth. So I really think that we have to do better. We have to take evidence seriously. We have to take the truth seriously, both as producers of evidence and as consumers of evidence. So what I want to do now is give you some advice. I apologize, but I'm here to give you some suggestions. And I've been working with data all my career, but in particular, working with data as a journalist, working with data as a writer, helping people to understand data for nearly 20 years. And I think I've learned a few things, and I'd like to share with you some of the things that I have learned over the years. So I want to give you 3 pieces of advice as consumers of evidence, people who read evidence and try to understand evidence and try to make sense of it. And I want to give you 3 pieces of advice as producers of evidence. Okay, so as consumers of evidence, I'll keep this very simple. Each of my pieces of advice begins with the letter C. So the first piece of advice is to be calm. Now, you won't find that in any statistical or evaluation textbook, but you need to be calm when you are looking at a piece of evidence, a headline, a tweet, a graph, a table. The reason this is important, can I quote one of my statistical heroes, Darth Vader from Star Wars? He tells Luke Skywalker, search your feelings. Yeah? We have to search our feelings when we're looking at data, because the thing that overwhelmingly affects what we think is how we feel. Do we feel angry? Do we feel upset? Do we feel entertained? Do we feel, oh, I feel justified. This is what I thought all along. Our emotions really color how we interpret what we're being told. And very often, the information that we are shown that information because it engages our emotions. If you think about social media, or if you think about a newspaper headline, it is being chosen for emotional engagement. Like, if people didn't feel emotions, the headline would be something else. So our emotions are being awakened by these headlines, by the information that we see. And we just need to take a little step back and say, how does this make me feel? And then the moment you have noticed how you feel, you can step forward again, look at the evidence, and it just seems totally different. Yeah? I'm not saying, oh, don't have emotions. Of course, we all have emotions. We're all human. But I am saying, just notice those emotions before you do anything else. So, advice number 1, be calm. Advice number 2 is to get context. Very often, people start thinking about the numbers before they've really understood where the numbers came from and what the numbers mean. I call this premature enumeration. And often people who are the most comfortable with data suffer from this the most. You see some claim, you see some evidence on a spreadsheet or whatever, and you download it and you start plotting it and taking correlation coefficients and running all your analysis without understanding, hang on, where did these numbers actually come from? What do these numbers actually mean? And context could mean all kinds of things. It could mean, like, what is the source of the data? Who is telling me this? Context could often mean useful historical comparisons. So you're telling me the budget this year. What was the budget 5 years ago? What was the budget 10 years ago? You're telling me the budget in this country. What is the budget in that country? Just simple comparisons to help make sense of the data. Or definitions. Just trying to understand, like, when you're talking about, I don't know, the number of nurses working in a healthcare system, if it's 2 part-time nurses, is that like 1 full-time nurse? Is that 2 people, or is that 1 person? And there's no right or wrong answer, but just understanding those definitions is absolutely essential to understanding the data. So 2 pieces of evidence, 2 pieces of advice: be calm, get context. And the third thing is to be curious. And this seems like it's the most obvious piece of advice of all. Just be curious, try to understand the world. But so often we don't treat evidence as something to be curious about. So often we treat evidence as a weapon in an argument. We are trying to convince somebody of something, to persuade somebody of something. Now, I want to use this evidence to achieve this goal, or use this evidence to win this argument. But actually, the first thing we should be doing is to use the evidence to understand the world around us. Only when you start like that can you do the other things. So be open-minded, open your eyes, and really ask yourself, what do I need to know? And does this evidence help me understand? Does it answer the questions that I have? If, as consumers of evidence, if we can respect those 3 pieces of advice, to be calm, to get context, and to be curious, that I think is more help than a PhD in statistics for evaluating quantitative claims about the world around us. But I said I would also give some advice to producers of evidence. And of course, some of the advice to producers is to think like a consumer. How do I present evidence in a way that helps people to be calm? How do I present evidence in a way that gives people the right context? It's astonishing the number of times I see a graph, even in a good newspaper, somebody who should know better. I see a graph, and the graph is plotted, and I just don't know what the definition is. I don't know something even really simple like, is this in nominal terms or real terms? Are they taking account of inflation? I don't know. Just got to give people context. But let me be a bit more specific for producers of evidence, because I think there's some stuff that we can do. So the first thing I would say is try to build in evidence by default. From the start of the projects that we're evaluating or looking at, the earlier you think about evaluation, the earlier you think about evidence, the better quality evidence you're going to get. I mean, let me give you an example of how this went wrong. This is an example from the UK. Of course, when COVID came, the UK shut schools. This happened in many countries. And we realized, oh, there's a problem because the schools are shut, so children will be falling behind. So how do we get children to catch up? And we looked at all the evidence that we had. We had really good, high-quality evidence about educational intervention. And the conclusion was, we need tuition in small groups. We need to get a tutor. We need to get a small number of students, put them together. That's how to help students catch up. And so the government paid for a small group tuition program. But then because they didn't think about evaluation by default, they didn't think about evidence by default, they didn't capture the basic data about that program. So we don't really know who received those interventions. We don't know which children got the tuition. We don't know what their educational level was before. We don't know what their educational level is now. We don't know whether that money was wasted or not. I mean, I hope it was a good program, but we don't really know because everything was rushed because of COVID, because people hadn't really thought about it. That was a real opportunity to learn for the future that we missed. So think about evidence by default from the start. The second piece of advice I would give is to try to think about the whole system and to link together evidence as much as you can. It's very easy to get into the habit of saying, well, we're going to evaluate this one small program, or we're going to evaluate this project. And that's important. But if you can get broader baseline data, if you can gather information that you can link to other pieces of information, you're going to learn much more over the long term. So trying to make those connections and to think systematically is incredibly helpful. I'll give you another quick example, again from the UK. Here, we had the situation in COVID of realizing, oh, people are going to just be trying COVID treatments kind of at random all over the world. We don't really know how to treat this illness. And then some professors in Oxford, where I'm from, thought, well, hang on, we could just set up a system to systematically evaluate this so that every time somebody comes into a hospital in the UK with severe COVID, they're all on the same system, they're all on the same database, and they will be given randomized treatments. And then within 6 weeks, we had information that a particular treatment, dexamethasone, could help people with severe COVID. And that's all about trying to build a system, a platform that links together everything that's going on in all these different sites to produce insights for everybody. So, first of all, evidence by default, evaluation by default, by design, from the beginning. Second, trying to link together as much information as possible, rather than just evaluating one project. And the third thing I would say is always be careful that your measures, your metrics, don't become targets. It's very, very easy when you start tracking some piece of information to go, oh, we want this number to go up. We're going to make this a target. But the moment something becomes a target is the moment evidence starts to get distorted. So I would always advise people to try to keep the evaluation as separate as possible from target settings. I'll give you one more example, and again, I'm going to talk about an example from the UK because it's the country I know best. But a few years ago, the government started setting targets. We want ambulances to arrive within 8 minutes. If there's an emergency call and it's serious, the ambulance needs to arrive in 8 minutes. And one of the things that happened was, there were many problems. One of the things that happened is if an ambulance was on its way to you and the 8 minutes expired, they might then redirect the ambulance to somebody who made the call after you, because they can still hit the 8-minute target for them, but not for you. So once people got through the 8-minute target, well, they kind of didn't really count anymore. It seems so simple. Oh, it's good for ambulances to arrive early, and it is. But the moment the measure became a target was the moment things started to go wrong. So I've given you 6 pieces of advice. That's probably too many for a 20-minute talk. As consumers, be calm, get context, be curious. And as producers, think about evidence by default from the start. Think about evaluating broadly and linking together different pieces of information. And don't let your measures become targets. But let me give you one final piece of advice about evidence. One of my great statistical heroes was the nurse, Florence Nightingale, who was active in the 1850s, so 170 years ago. She was a real pioneer of nursing, but many people don't know she was also the first woman to be a member of the Royal Statistical Society. She was a pioneering statistician. And she was an incredible communicator of evidence and producer of these astonishing graphics that really changed the way the UK thought about sanitation and public health. She was active during the Crimean War in the 1850s. She'd chart all this information about soldiers dying in the war. But she did something else. Every time a soldier died in one of her hospitals, when she arrived, they weren't even being counted, let alone the situation being analyzed. Every time a soldier died in one of her hospitals, Florence Nightingale would take that moment to write to that soldier's family informing them. And it was just that realization that, yes, you can do all you can as a practitioner, and you can do all you can as a scientist, as an evaluator of evidence. But you should never forget that ultimately all of these numbers are about people's lives, people's well-being. And you need to remember the people that these numbers represent. That's something that Florence Nightingale always did. And it's something I try to do, but it's never easy, because the numbers are so seductive, and it's easy to forget that behind those numbers are human beings. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks very much. So we now have a very short interlude while these extremely fit gentlemen bring on these chairs. It's going to be very exciting. As Manny explained, we couldn't actually light a fire here, which is a big shame. I would have liked to have a fire, but you can't have everything. But in a moment, Vice-President Scott is going to come on and ask me difficult questions about all the things I couldn't really deal with in a 20-minute talk, and we'll have a good conversation. But a round of applause for our amazing furniture removal guys. And please welcome VP Scott to the stage. Hi, Scott. How are you?
Thanks.
So, shall I go here?
Either one. Well, Tim Harford, welcome to Asian Evaluation Week. And let me say, that was truly excellent. And both insightful, entertaining, and beyond that shameless flattery, I do want to come back to what I think is actually an interesting set of questions around the role that exactly this sort of presentation plays. So, but we'll come back to that later. I think maybe to kick us off, I want to dive into some of the fun stuff. So you used quite a few examples from recent history, a bit farther back. But I think as we think about the evidence agenda, data, we tend to think of it as a modern phenomenon.
Yeah.
So help us actually understand the longer history, and maybe you have some examples to draw on that go back quite a bit.
It goes back a long way. I mean, the history of evidence and particularly the history of randomized trials is absolutely astonishing. I mean, I particularly love Austin Bradford Hill when he was evaluating this evidence on smoking. He wrote to every doctor in the UK to ask about their smoking habits, because he realized, if you write to doctors, you know where doctors are because they're all on the medical register, so you're not going to lose them. And when a doctor dies, you'll get a good evaluation of cause of death. So your data is going to be really, really good. So he writes to all these doctors, asking them about their smoking habits. And the doctors realize what he's doing, and it's not very popular because they don't like the sense that maybe smoking is dangerous. And at a dinner party, one doctor comes up to Austin Bradford Hill and says, "Oh, so you're the man who wants us all to stop smoking, are you?" And Austin Bradford Hill says, "No, not at all. I just want to know how you die. If you stop smoking, I want to know how you die. And if you keep smoking, I want to know how you die. So stop smoking or keep smoking, I'll chalk up your death anyway. It'll be very useful." So, I mean, this is a good example, I think, of really being data-driven. I should say, by the way, also, Austin Bradford Hill trained as an economist, which is probably how he got to be so charming. But it goes further back. I mean, you said that we think of evaluation as a modern phenomenon, and evidence as a modern phenomenon. And in a way, it is. So Austin Bradford Hill ran the world's first rigorous, double-blind, randomized clinical trial. And he did that. That published its results, I think, in 1948. So you think that is after the atomic bomb, that is after aeroplanes, that is after the invention of the computer. And the randomized trial it's such a simple idea, right? You give the treatment to some people, and you give a control to other people at random. It seems so simple. the idea that we really only perfected how to do that in the 1940s is extraordinary. But there are examples going further back of people trying to do this. So there was an Islamic scholar who, in the 9th century, did what seems to be a clinical trial of treatments for meningitis. And he found, I think, that bloodletting cures meningitis. So bloodletting doesn't cure meningitis. So there was obviously some problem, and we think probably it was that the trial wasn't blinded or properly randomized. So he was looking at people and going, okay, you get the bloodletting treatment, you don't. You get the bloodletting treatment, you don't. And it looks like a controlled trial, but it wasn't properly randomized, probably is the problem. And then, since we're here in China, very, very often China is the pioneer in everything, technology, science, everything. So again, a pioneer in a controlled trial. There was a trial of ginseng root. So they gave ginseng root to one group and no ginseng to another group. And both groups got to run 1 mile. And then they examined the effects. And they concluded that the group that received the ginseng were fitter, they were less out of breath. It was great. And this is 1,000 years ago. So you think, wow, they nailed it. They got everything. The only problem is the size of the treatment of the control groups. So in the treatment group, there was 1 man, and in the control group, there was 1 man. So they so nearly got it. They so nearly had the idea. If you had 100 in each group, then maybe you have something. So this goes back a long way. But really, it is striking how many subtle things there are that can go wrong with evaluation. And I think we understand how to do it well. We now understand how to do randomized trials well. We understand how to do non-randomized work well. But it's a reminder that a lot of this stuff is not common sense, which I think is striking because when you look at the history of quantification, that goes back 10,000 years. Mm-hmm. If you want to go back to people kind of carefully counting stuff and recording what they were counting, you can go back to Mesopotamia and the very first use of clay before pots, before bricks, before tiles was counting tokens. And you can count, okay, there's sheep, we can count the sheep with the counting tokens. And the very first writing was to take those counting tokens and to press them into clay tablets, and that's 5,000 years ago. So accountancy is 10,000 years old. Randomized trials are 70 years old. And I think that really tells us the difference between just getting the numbers and thinking really rigorously about how to interpret those numbers.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And the bloodletting example, I think, is a good one for if you don't do it right or well, it's probably worse than not having done it at all. I mean, because you've produced bad evidence and misinformation. By the way, for the audience, just to say, I have my own questions. We're going to spend some time on them, but I will turn to you later in the discussion, so please be thinking about questions you would want to ask Tim a bit later. So let me preface this next question with a bit of a personal bio. So I spent much of my career in large government bureaucracies in the United States, but then I had this 10-year period right before I came to ADB where I was at a think tank. And it was a very sort of luxurious time of it's me, it's a research assistant, and maybe collaborate with other fellows, but you're not really having to think about a bureaucratic structure or, I had the luxury of learning and then advising, and that was that. And then I come to ADB, which is coming back into a big bureaucracy. So I find, the question that is often in the forefront of my mind in the past year that I've spent at ADB is, how are we learning as an institution? Yeah. One thing that strikes me, and it harkens back to my earlier experience in different government roles, is I do worry sometimes, and this is not to pick on the ADB because I think this is a general comment, there's a little bit of the illusion of knowledge in the sense that, we have very deep channels of information flow, for multilateral development banks that has a lot to do with our relationship with government counterparts. So we have access to reams of data coming from those governments' data that we generate. And then we have dedicated functions in the organization, like the evaluation function, which is essential. But I keep coming back to this larger question: how do we learn? How do we know we're learning? How do we know that we're adapting to what we learn? So, I'd be interested on how you situate this agenda in a bureaucratic context, basically.
Yeah, and organizations do change, but they change slowly and they learn slowly. And I think if I had the answer to that, then I probably wouldn't be a journalist. I'd be running some amazing organization doing amazing things. But so one I think important idea is biases in the flow of information. Like what information gets gathered, what information gets shared, what information do people pay attention to, and what information do people ignore. There's a very interesting study of this by the Harvard Business School academic Amy Edmondson. So very early in her career, she was studying the effectiveness of surgical teams. So there was this idea that they'd looked at aeroplane crews, and they thought, aeroplane crews who are fresh will make better decisions than aeroplane crews who are tired. And it turns out it wasn't true. And the reason is because the airplane crews who were tired, sure they were tired, but they'd also had more experience working with each other. So, and that was more important, that the experience and the comfort with each other outweighed the fact that people were cognitively fatigued. So she thought, oh, this is interesting. The effectiveness of the team is more important than the effectiveness of the individual. So then she looks at surgical teams, and she's trying to measure the effectiveness of collaboration and the team spirit. And what she's trying to do is to figure out, do teams that work well as teams make fewer mistakes in the operating theater? And you would think, oh yeah, it's obvious. Of course they do, obviously. And she gathers the information, and no, it's totally wrong. The best teams make the most mistakes. And she thought, well, this is a disaster. I'm never going to get my PhD. I'm a failure as an academic. And she can't figure it out. And she looks and looks, and in the end, she realizes what is really going on. It's not that the best teams make the most mistakes. It's that the best teams report their mistakes. Whereas the dysfunctional teams who blame each other, they just bury every mistake. It never gets talked about. It never gets written up. And this is such an important insight into, do these numbers that we have in front of us really reflect the world, or are they being distorted by the politics of the bureaucracy? And the idea that Amy Edmondson popularized was called psychological safety. So the idea of psychological safety is, do I feel safe if I see a problem, if there's something that the organization needs to pay attention to, do I feel that I can report that or not? And clearly that applies to things like safety, surgical safety, airplane accidents, but much more broadly to any organization. Do people see a problem, do they feel they can report the problem? So I think that is really, really fundamental to any organization being able to learn and to change. The other thing worth mentioning is something I said earlier in the talk of building in evidence from the start. If you can build in your evaluation, your evidence gathering before a project even starts, that is hopefully when people are still maximally curious. Once the project has started and the money is flowing and somebody's in charge, then of course somebody has something to defend. And it's more difficult to take the evidence seriously because you have vested interests. But before any of that happens, of course there is still vested interest, of course there's still politics. But the earlier the evidence gathering comes, the earlier you can have that conversation, the more likely people are to be curious and open-minded and willing to change direction. I mean, I feel we could have this conversation for a week and not answer all the questions, but those are two things I think are important.
Yeah, that's great, and particularly that last point, I think there's something very powerful when you start early on an ex-ante basis, that you bind all the parties to say, we agree that we're going to follow this approach to being guided by the evidence, which sort of perhaps lessens a defensive posture that those of us who are on the consumption side of this equation feel. Which I do want to go to your 3 C's basically, which I do think are very helpful. In a sense, set a high bar for the consumers of evidence and data do have some obligations, that they should hold themselves to some real standards, so I think it would help to elaborate, even on the first, the emotional component here, and the importance of remaining calm. One just sees so many times the instinct to react in a defensive way. It's really hard to overcome that. But so why don't we? I'd like you to spend a bit more time elaborating on this kind of advice and why it matters and what it can look like in practice.
Yeah, I mean, one important thing is, of course, this needs to come from management. If management are modeling open-minded curiosity, a willingness to learn, a willingness to make mistakes, then people lower down in the organization will see that. And if that is not the example that management set, well, everyone else takes the cue from those leaders. So what should management be modeling? What should leaders be demonstrating? One book I read a couple of years ago that I found very interesting, just in terms of the way that it framed this problem, is Julia Galef's book, The Scout Mindset. So Galef basically says, okay, there are 2 mindsets. Of course, this is always a massive oversimplification, but I found it useful. There are 2 mindsets in thinking about evidence and thinking about argument. You can have the soldier mindset, or you can have the scout mindset. And the soldier mindset thinks of evidence as it's part of a battle. Like, we have this position, we need to defend this position, we need to attack people who are coming against our position, and evidence is all part of that battle. And when you phrase it like that, you go, oh, well, that's not how we should treat evidence. But of course, that is very often how people treat evidence. I suppose it's a little bit like a courtroom as well. Like, you have the prosecution and you have the defense. So we're either the prosecution or the defense, but we're viewing evidence very, very selectively to make our case. And Galef says, okay, but there's another way to think about it, which is the scout mindset, which is, well, there's a world out there that we don't really know, we don't really understand. We need to just go out there and make a map, scout it out, find out what's out there, you could be asking all kinds of questions, but the point is, you're asking questions because you want to know, rather than you're asking questions because you want to win. And I think that scout mindset is a very useful way to think about curiosity, because that's really, we're talking about curiosity again, the same thing. But rather than that soldier mindset, everything is a weapon in an argument. The scout mindset, which is basically, I am just going out there and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I've always found that to be a useful way of thinking about things. And yes, to come back to that, if leaders in an organization are modeling the scout mindset rather than the soldier mindset, then everybody will take that cue.
Yeah, that's great. I've often thought there's a lot to learn from relationship counseling for bureaucracies, and namely, the instinct to be right and show that you're right is not a helpful instinct in a lot of contexts. So it's a lot about how you approach the evidence you have and conveying it. So I very much appreciate that. I don't think we can have a conversation these days about virtually any aspect of public life, but certainly the use of data that does not grapple with artificial intelligence, and maybe putting that in a context of technology, generally digital technologies. I guess if let's try to frame this discussion a bit narrowly on, because we were talking last night over dinner about thinking of AI in terms of risks and opportunities for developing countries and their economies broadly. But if we focus the conversation here on what it means for the agenda we're talking about, I mean, how would you sort of scope out both risks and opportunities, and where are we going on how data can be generated in remarkable ways, and then marshaled, and how should we be thinking of this as a set of professional evaluators?
Yeah. So, I mean, AI is obviously very exciting. I think the thing that we forget, we think very much in terms of like, oh, is the AI better than the humans yet? Whose job is it going to take? Either from the point of view of a manager, like who can I fire and replace with AI? Or from the point of view of a person, am I going to get fired and replaced with AI? But, and of course that's important, those are important discussions, but for most tasks, what is happening is you have humans using AIs. And then the question is not how good is the AI, but how good is the team? And there are reasons to believe that we systematically underrate the importance of this. So, I mean, one just astonishing example that I wrote about in my book, Messy, is, and I wrote this example while I was on a transatlantic flight, so maybe it was a bit, it's about a transatlantic flight that crashes. So the Air France flight from Rio to Paris in 2009. And what happened there was, this is a perfectly good aircraft, nothing wrong with the aircraft, that the pilots crashed because they were used to the autopilot flying the plane, and they were used to the autopilot helping them fly the plane in all kinds of subtle ways. They didn't even really understand the help that they were receiving. And when they flew into a storm and some sensors were temporarily iced up, the autopilot switched off, handed control of the plane to a young pilot who didn't have much experience, who was feeling nervous, and he then started to move the plane around in a way that if the autopilot was engaged, it wouldn't have let him do it. So he pointed the nose of the plane up. The plane was already very high, and so the plane starts to stall like that. And it's such a basic thing. A pilot should not stall a plane. But this pilot was used to the idea that you can't stall a plane. You can't stall a plane because the autopilot won't let you stall the plane. And they spent several minutes just stalling, right down into the Atlantic, killed everybody, just because they just couldn't understand what was happening now that the autopilot was off. I think it's just a reminder that we can rely on these artificial systems in a way that we don't even notice that we're losing our own skills. And there's a much more recent example, which is less dramatic, but much closer to contemporary AI. Actually, there are two examples. One involves job recruitment. So researchers at Harvard Business School gave job recruiters an algorithm that evaluated resumes and helped say, okay, this is the best resume, this is the best candidate. And this was a randomized trial. So some job recruiters, and these are real job recruiters, real resumes, and the software is commercially used. So this is a very realistic trial. So some of these recruiters were given the best algorithm. They were told this algorithm is excellent. Some of them were given a degraded algorithm. They were told this algorithm is quite good, but sometimes it makes mistakes. And some of them got no algorithm. So the question is, who did the best? And people with the algorithms did better than the people with no algorithm. Of course, the decision support you're getting from the artificial intelligence helps. But people with the best algorithm did worse than people with the degraded algorithm. And the reason is the people with the best algorithm were like, okay, fine, the computer can decide. Whereas people who were told, well, this algorithm makes mistakes, they were still engaged, they were switched on, they were paying attention, they were looking at the advice of the algorithm, but they were also contributing their own insights. And the title of that study is called Falling Asleep at the Wheel. So it's this idea of you hand over to the computer and then you stop thinking. It's a problem. So the interaction between the humans and the computers is really important. And there's another recent example, a study that was done of brainstorming. Same basic problem. You think, oh, ChatGPT is amazing at brainstorming. But what happened is you ask people to brainstorm, to generate lots and lots of ideas in a team. And if you give them ChatGPT, which you would think is the greatest brainstorming tool ever developed, what happens is the researchers said it's like people had resting AI face. They just sit there going, huh. They stop talking to each other. They just type into the computer gives them some answers. They're like, okay, whatever. Because they don't really, they get stuck. Oh, it's kind of like an internet search. I just type in the answer, I get back the answer. The exercise is over. So just to step back, I think the really, really big question with AI is how do we make these AIs work in a way that brings the best out of the humans, rather than designing the AIs to just maximize the performance of the AI. There is when we think about the possibilities of digital technology, there is an amazing example that doesn't involve AI, if we've got time. I'd love to tell you about it. So I already talked a little bit about the recovery trial, which is designed by two Oxford academics. There is another amazing thing coming out of Oxford. So I apologize, because I'm from Oxford, so I'm giving you all the cool stuff from Oxford. But it's a platform called Open Safely. So just to think about this is all of the patient data from the UK's National Health Service. So this is very, very, very sensitive personal information. Like if you have an embarrassing disease, and maybe you have a sexually transmitted disease, and I know when you got it, and it was after you met your partner, and it's so sensitive, this personal information. But it's tens of millions of people. You have data going back decades. This is incredibly important for producing medical insights. So the question is, how do you unlock the insights without damaging patient privacy? And this platform is called Open Safely. And the way Open Safely works is you, as a researcher, you program a little robot. The robot goes into the data warehouse. I mean, it's not actually a physical robot, it's a software robot, but the robot goes into the data warehouse with your instructions to perform this analysis, and it comes back with the analysis. You never see the underlying patient data. You never see the individual patient records. But you can ask all kinds of analytical questions and get the results back. So that's great because it preserves patient privacy. But what's really exciting is, as well as, it's not just the patient privacy. Now think about the scientific process. In order to type those instructions to the robot, by design, the platform shares my code with every other researcher on the platform. So now all the code is publicly available. So if I made a mistake in my analysis, nobody needs to say, oh, please will you send me your code. The code is there. Someone could say, you could look at my code and go, Tim, you made a statistical error in your code. Your analysis is not valid. Everybody can see it. You can fix it. Everybody can see you fix it. Everyone can see the better code. Or maybe you want to do some analysis and you have my code is good. You take my code and you put it into your code. So there's sharing, there's reusing, there is replication, there is error correction. All of this is happening absolutely by default, by design. It's not possible to use the platform without sharing and evaluating each other's code. At the same time, the patient privacy is completely protected. So obviously this is about health data, but I really think it's a great example of thinking about, if you think systematically from the start, you can design platforms that maximize scientific rigor and transparency while protecting the interests of the people whose data it is.
Yeah, that's hugely compelling, frankly. I guess I want to think about how you situate that example. I mean, number one, there's a public context. I mean, we would want to see, say, a smart and enlightened government adopting that kind of practice across the, using their instrument, whether it's, the power of regulation or otherwise the funding to research institutions that would, but, we can't necessarily count on private actors to be so enlightened. I guess the bigger question, I'm curious how you think about it, is in these moments when we have innovation and technology adoption moving much faster than the ability of public actors to respond, do you worry a lot about it, or do you tend to think, well, over time, sort of smooths out, we're okay, we have earlier historical examples, but I do feel like we sit in a moment that feels less like we can draw on historical examples. We feel maybe more concerned about what we already see, including even basic things like our kids on social media, and hard to see a positive correction to that. But I mean, how do you think in a much bigger picture way about the pace of innovation and to some degree the harms, and then the ability to harness it as a public good?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard to think of a more important question, to be honest, and I wish I had an easier answer. But I mean, clearly, I want to see as much technological innovation as possible, although we're constantly telling ourselves, oh, the pace of change has never been so quick. If you look at the productivity data, that's not true. Mm-hmm. And you could reflect, oh, well, 100 years ago, we were seeing the diffusion of electricity, the internal combustion engine, indoor plumbing, bulk chemical processing. Robert Gordon famously set out the economist Robert Gordon set out these ideas in the 1990s, basically saying, yeah, sure, the internet's good, it's nice, it's important, but is it really more radical than all of these changes that took place? Oh, and also information and communications technologies, so television, radio, the telegraph. All of this is happening between 1870 and 1920, maybe? Is the internet really more important than that? Is the computer revolution more important than that? Maybe. So to some extent, I think, oh, it would be great if we could go even faster. And certainly when you think about the adoption of clean technologies, solar, wind, battery technologies, you want to see more progress. But I do share your concern that it's very hard for regulators to keep up. And when you look at, for example, the digital economy, the knowledge economy, we have a lot of regulatory ideas that were really formulated in the 1980s, the 1990s, about copyright and intellectual property that don't really work very well for a lot of what's going on right now. So trying to think about how artificial intelligence is trained on data, people are trying to frame that as a copyright issue. It's not a copyright issue. Copyright law doesn't really help you frame that public policy question. And so I share your concerns. What we do about it, I don't know, I wish I had an answer.
Fair enough. If you, and thinking about technology alongside the larger agenda around data generation and data use and evidence, so advice to us at the Asian Development Bank, at other institutions represented in the room, one of the things we do, bank is in our name, we lend money. If you were thinking about that marginal dollar that we provide to, particularly to government counterparts, where would you want it invested when it comes to improving the way country by country that, as a public function, evidence is marshaled? Is it about data generation? Is it about greater capacity? I mean, all these things are important, but where are the biggest returns?
Yeah. Well, I'd want to be led by the evidence. So, do we have good evidence on what the highest marginal return projects are? That would be something to ask. But my instinct is, this is just an instinct, I could be wrong, but my instinct is that we, when it comes to data, when it comes to evidence, we probably find it easier to think about that on a project-by-project basis, and we find it harder to think systematically. So if you're thinking about evaluating some healthcare project, for example, sure, you could set up a randomization scheme, and you could run a randomized trial that says, oh yeah, the hospitals that got this technology or that used this protocol, or the communities where they got these clinics funded or whatever, they do better or they don't do better, and we are confident in this because we have a randomized trial. That's all great, but it's so much easier if the entire country has really good birth and death records, for example, or maternal mortality records, or records of vaccinations. If you have like really good basic national public health statistics, everything else becomes easier. But sometimes those things are not so easy to fund, because that is a basic governmental capacity, of course. Even better is if the national statistics in one country are in some way comparable with the national statistics in another country, and then you can start making international comparisons. So the better the underlying data, the broader and the more robust the conclusions that we can draw. I'm really interested by some of the work that Raj Chetty's team is doing in the United States. So Raj Chetty is kind of this amazing economist who's now like half my age. He's just absurdly young. But some of what they're doing is they're looking at really old randomized social experiments. Some of them going back, I think, to the 1960s. A lot of stuff from the 70s, some from the 1990s. So quite old stuff. And they're linking that to really sophisticated administrative data. So, for example, tax records. So you could go, oh, some of these kids got into this kindergarten program in like the 1960s, say, on a randomized basis. But we can link that data to tax records. And so we now know what those kids are earning today. And so by linking what was actually quite a small randomized study to much broader data, you get much more insight. So I think that's something that my instinct is to favor. Another thing, maybe just to mention briefly, is the usefulness of good systematic reviews. So, and I can't believe I'm going to tell you one more thing that came out of Oxford, but please forgive me. So there was this Scottish doctor called Archie Cochrane, who was a real pioneer in the 20th century in evidence-based medicine. So he would do things like run randomized trials, and then when everybody saw the data, they would be like, oh, this is a terrible, unethical trial. You need to stop the trial. And then he would show, oh, interesting, because I actually swapped the data results over. So in fact, the thing that this is like heart surgeons who have these special heart wards. He's like, oh, it looks like the randomized trial actually shows that your specialized heart wards are damaging patient health. You really think it's an unethical trial now? So he was like this very impish, mischievous person who would really praise evidence and was a pioneer in randomized controlled trials. In the 1970s, a few years before he died, he started saying, it's a real problem. We have all these randomized trials in medicine, but there's no systematic, well-organized place that you could go to view these randomized trials. So if you want to know, oh, if I give steroids to somebody after a head injury, is that helpful? These trials have been done, but where's the public repository of all the evidence? And then after he died, an Oxford academic called Ian Chalmers set up the Cochrane Library and the Cochrane Collaboration in memory of Archie Cochrane. And anybody who knows anything about medical evidence knows Cochrane is this, it's this global organization, an amazing resource that just systematically puts together all of these different studies of, does yoga prevent incontinence? Well, there's a Cochrane review. We could all of the studies that were done of this. What's the evidence on deworming? What's the evidence on dexamethasone or whatever? All of these things, Cochrane have done a study. So it's an amazing resource, and it's quite cheap, really, in terms of the amount of money it takes to just assemble the data that's already been done and review it systematically and evaluate the quality of the evaluation. It's really important. Now, we also have the Campbell collaboration, which is the same thing but for social science and public policy. And we have, there's a development database as well, isn't there? Is it 3E's?
3IE, yeah.
3IE.
Which is here at the conference.
Yeah, 3IE. So, yes. which is cheap, but I think it's good value, right? It's good. Yeah, it's good value. But it's hard, I think, to get these things funded.
That's right.
When they're absolutely, it's a fundamental kind of resource that is kind of actually nobody's problem, right?
Yeah.
And so my instinct, and I would like to have better data on this, but my instinct is that these kind of systematic overviews and trying to get baseline coverage gets undervalued, and what gets overvalued is project-by-project evaluation, which is also important, of course, but if I could nudge people to think more systematically, I would.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, this basic dilemma of cheap but underinvested,
Yeah.
it's a real challenge. I'm going to turn to all of you in just a minute. I'm going to come back to the question that I previewed at the outset. So this is sort of what it is that Tim Harford does for a living. And I said this to you a bit ago before this talk. It's been my observation that as economists get old, they start to rely more on stories than they do on citing the literature. And you can interpret that either in a kind way or an unkind way.
And you can see me in the video getting older and older and older
right.
and telling more and more stories. Yeah.
But just to say, we could think, well, maybe they're getting a little lazier as they age, and it's easier to tell a story than not. But actually, I suspect, and as I look at your work, it's much more about recognizing the need to go beyond the technical. That is the base. But when it comes to translating into the policy world in particular, there's a really critical bridge there, and that is where, from my perspective, exactly what you do in, identifying the compelling examples, creating the narrative, to some degree entertaining. Those are all elements that need to be adopted to a greater degree. It can't strictly be, so specialized a field that frankly you are one of a small number, I think, that do this effectively, and there's a market for it. But as we think about the power of narrative, of storytelling to augment data, maybe if you could reflect on that, but frankly also reflect on what you see as your responsibilities. I mean, because this can be done, it can go directly, there can be a version of you that is just directly feeding misinformation consistently. So how do you get it right? How do we, I think you've already addressed this to some degree, but how do we bring more of what you do into what we do?
Absolutely. I think it's really fundamental. It's an important question because we're talking about how do ideas get from one mind to another mind. And the answer is stories. That's how most humans communicate. If you want people to listen to you, you tell them a story. If you want people to remember what you said, you tell them a story. If you want people to believe you, you tell them a story. So then one of the questions is, well, how do we know that the story is true? And more than just true, is it representative? Because you can tell a true story, but it can also... many stories are interesting because they are, in fact, not representative. They're unusual. So for me, I think it's important that the evidence comes first. So the stories are really part of the soldier mindset. They're part of convincing other people. So start with a scout mindset. Start with trying to understand the world, and once you've understood, and then you're trying to explain to somebody else, then you switch to the story. If you start with the story and then start looking around for the evidence to support your story, then this is no good. And of course, many people do that, and it's easier that way. But fundamentally, you need to first of all understand what's true, and then the story is about communication. But communication is really important. If you just show people the data or show people a bunch of bullet points, that's not memorable, it's not persuasive, people switch off. A story is really important. Now, I mean, we could talk about the craft of storytelling and how to make a really compelling protagonist, and you need a twist, and you need a story arc, and you need character growth, and you can get very sophisticated about this, but I think for most people, you don't need all of that. It's often just, could you please just give me a specific example? Yeah? So if you can say in general, AI may disrupt labor markets, or sure, but give me an example. And we were discussing this last night. Oh, well, okay, let's think about a company that is working in business process outsourcing. Let's be specific. Where are they based? Okay, they're based in Kuala Lumpur, and this company provides services to. And you list, they work with these people, and they work with these people, and let's meet somebody give them a name, who works for this company, and what is their job. And every day they log onto their computer, or they pick up their phone, and inquiries come in, and this is what they do. And then just imagine bringing in Claude or GPT-4, and this is how their job would be destroyed. And suddenly I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. Because you can say, oh, yes, AI might disrupt labor markets, but I don't know, what are you talking about? You give a specific example, and then, okay, now I see, now I understand what's going on. So just being specific and concrete about individual named people doing things or having things happen to them, and that is just incredibly clarifying. If they're heroic, if the story is heartbreaking, then sure, that's more emotionally resonant. But just for clarity, just to be really clear and specific about what you're talking about. And then you can show the graph. Then you can present the data. Sure, but now I understand what you're saying, and I think that's really important. So data first, evidence first, find out what's true, then find the story, and then when you're communicating, you start with the story, and then you can present the evidence.
That's great. And when I said aging economist, that was when I was supposed to name names, but I'm not going to do that. So,
we can all identify specific people.
Pick your favorites. Please put your hand up if you have a question. There will be a microphone that comes to you. And my request is that you follow what I tried to establish as good practice in actually posing a question. Right here, Justine.
Yeah, there's a question already. Justine will come to you in a minute. The mic will take some. Yeah, please go ahead. Please introduce yourself, and I'll pass my mic on to you.
Hello, I'm Mala from Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And I would like to come back to your last advice, where you said we should be careful that measures do not become targets, which sounds very logical with this ambulance example. But then I look at my work in evaluation, and I find it difficult to translate into evaluation practice, because when we look at projects and programs, they usually have targets. And one core area of evaluation is to look at the achievement of output and outcome impact targets. So it's one core area of evaluation where we look at targets, and ideally they are monitored and measured. So we also have the best data available, often on targets, because that's where the energy goes in monitoring. So I see a tension between wanting unbiased measurement and having this core role of targets in project and program evaluations. And I want to hear how you would deal with that.
Sure. I think the tension is very real. The more focus there is on the target, the more risk there is of having a bias in the data. And I know I'm not the only person to think this. I know Angus Deaton, Nobel laureate, says you can gather this as much information you like about something like, say, inflation. You can gather data on price levels, but the moment this data suddenly becomes connected to flows of money, then the data starts to break down, because the incentive to distort the data becomes too great. So fundamentally, I would always try to limit the extent to which we are looking at highly incentivized targets. To some extent, this is just inevitable. You can see it, for example, in the scientific literature. We kind of got this target that nobody ever really said, that if you hit P is less than 0.05, then you have statistical significance, and then your paper is good, your paper is publishable, and if you don't hit P equals 0.05, your paper is not publishable. This is incredibly stupid. Everyone sort of agrees it's stupid, but we can't seem to break out of this. But it distorts the scientific literature. So I'm not suggesting this is easy, but I am suggesting it's a real problem to think about. So what would I suggest? So first of all, when you're producing these indicators, can we keep them as indicators, or do we have to make them targets? Do we make somebody's promotion dependent on them? Do we make someone's bonus dependent on them? Or are they just, we're monitoring this? The Open Safely program is a really good example about this. You can, one of the things it does is it produces fantastic information about prescription data, like clinics all across the UK, what drugs are they prescribing? But the Professor Goldacre, who runs this platform, is very insistent. These are indicators. Like they don't tell you if someone is doing a good job or a bad job. You shouldn't make them targets. They just kind of give you a sense of what's going on. But if you want to understand why it's going on, you need to look deeper. You can't just look at this indicator and say, yes, tick or cross. So try to avoid making things targets if you can. And then the other question is to think about how could the target be manipulated. Very often, the number is trustworthy until it becomes a target, and then it is not trustworthy. So we don't think ahead about this. So with the ambulance thing, if people had thought about it, you could see how could this be manipulated. And there were lots and lots of examples. One thing was simply, we have second-by-second data, and it was amazing how many ambulances arrived at 7 minutes, 58 seconds, or 7 minutes, 59 seconds, and no ambulance arrived at 8 minutes. And this was just the ambulance dispatcher has the ability to press the button and go, okay, the ambulance has arrived. And so it was like, it's like with a taxi. You order a taxi and the taxi's not there, and you call and they're like, oh, yeah, he's just on the street, he's just outside. But he's not, he's still 2 minutes away. It's the same thing. Oh, yeah, the ambulance, it's basically there. We stop, but the ambulance is still coming. So there are lots and lots of ways in which it could be manipulated. So trying to think about that, how could the data be gamed? But I don't pretend that this is just let's just not have targets and it's fine. I mean, I realize there is pressure to have targets, but we need to resist that pressure because it causes distortion every time it happens.
Okay, I think we have time for two more questions.
Well, we've got loads of questions. for those who don't have time, come and find me at lunch.
Yes.
Shenbing Yao here. I was with ADB, and I'm now visiting fellow in Shanghai. So thank you very much, Mr. Harford and the Vice President Scott, for the wonderful discussion. I have a very brief question about priors, about what do you do with priors in all these evidence-based work evaluations. But let me put put the question in context. If I may, use your first name as the to phrase that context, the team. So time, incentives, and madness. So the time we're all working in the institutions. We're all working with that prior and knowledge. So the time we're all under the pressure produce and work. We all have certain incentives, either self-inflicted or externally imposed. That incentives to do so, to do certain things, and of course, as Vice President Morris mentioned, that is the management context. So there's a management out there and a dictate, and whether, so if I may say that there's a concern about the method, the mad with the method, or madness of with the method, or see the method in the madness, the work of your term, the messiness. So how, in this context, and here, when we do the evidence evaluation, your talk gives us a sort of very insightful message about how to right the wrongs of evidence-based cliches. But in doing so, we all are social animals. We all have our priors. We all have our references. Or in a development parlance, there's a good practice, so-called, out there. In all this work, how do we make best use, make intelligent use of the priors in this and evidence-based inquiry? So that's my question. Thank you.
It's such an interesting question. So one part of the answer, I would say, one thing I said is, be calm, notice how you're feeling, notice your emotions. So I would also suggest, let's try and notice our priors. Like, what are the assumptions that we're making? What is it that everybody in this room agrees on without even realizing that they agree on it? And are those priors actually correct? That's very hard. So how do you do it? Well, one possibility is to try to get different views in the room. So if you bring in people with a different background, with a different perspective, that often feels aggravating. Yeah, because this person sees things differently. So why are they making trouble? Why are they always asking questions? Why can't they just agree like everyone else agrees? So it's a challenge, but to bring in those external perspectives, those diverse perspectives, is lots of reasons diversity is important. But to have those diverse perspectives lets you understand what your priors are and whether those priors are helpful or whether they're getting in the way of the truth. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we can always try to shift our priors. And so when I talk, for example, about building in evidence by default from the start, that could just be a prior that we all try to agree on. Like when we're looking at a project, when we're thinking about what we're going to fund, what we're going to support, just to have that as being, yeah, and of course, what's the baseline data? Can we agree on the aims of the project? Is that a prior that we can all agree on? But I think it's a little bit like Scott's question earlier about how do organizations change and adapt. I think in some ways it's a brilliant question, and in other ways it's such a hard question because we know that this is really difficult stuff. But that's what I would suggest.
Okay, I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. I'm sure there are a lot of good questions from the audience. As Tim said, he will be joining you all for lunch, so feel free to approach him then. I do want all of us to express our thanks to Tim for what really has been an excellent 90 minutes of insight. I learned a lot. I expect you did as well. So let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.